I never imagined that being stuck in an elevator in a Manhattan hotel with a CEO would transform my life. The sentence played in my head like a private joke as we stepped into the brushed steel box, the kind with soft lighting that makes strangers look less like strangers and more like minor characters in someone else's story. I had a small paper bag of the wedding present in my lap, two hardcover copies of a children's anthology my aunt had loved, and a nervousness that had nothing to do with the gift. It had been one of those days that telescoped. The train delayed, a coffee spilled in my tote, a last-minute request from the bookstore where I worked. I had taken the subway uptown, changed into sensible heels in the ladies' room, and told myself with the familiar mixture of stubbornness and hope that I could belong anywhere for one evening. He slid in after me at the last moment, closing the door with a soft, practiced motion. Jake Bennett. He wore confidence the way some people wear coats, effortless, tailored, slightly dangerous at the edges. His suit was charcoal, cut to make broad shoulders and narrow intentions, and his coat carried the faint woody note of cedar and smoke. People had said his name as if it were an event. When he smiled, nothing exploded, but the room shifted, an unspoken rearrangement of attention. He pressed the button for the 50th floor without looking, and for a moment I wondered if he knew who I was. The city is a place where anonymity and notoriety share the same elevator. The doors hummed closed and the carriage lifted, the floor indicator lighting up with patient green numbers. We both brushed the same brass handrail at the same time. He pulled his hand back as if realizing the contact, and in the pause between two polite gestures, the light went out. Not a complete blackout, just the soft glow dimmed into a stubborn night. The floor indicator froze on 42, and the elevator shuddered as though someone had put a hand on its throat. There was a small collective exhale. He pressed the alarm, one of those hotel boxes with a direct line to someone who speaks in reassuring cliches. A recorded voice told us someone would be there shortly. The polite kind of waiting began. The shuffle of feet, the minute rearrangement of belongings, the small talk that tumbles out in uncomfortable spaces. Rain began to pat the metal seam of the door like someone drumming their fingers, and the air conditioner hummed with the tired insistence of a machine doing its job. "Not the best timing," I said, because I had to say something and because my stomach had folded itself into the shape of my knees. I tried to be light. He gave a little laugh, the one that looked practiced because he never wanted to reveal more than a few degrees of himself to anyone. "No," he said, "not great. There is a particular intimacy to being trapped with someone you're supposed to be invisible in front of. There are no witnesses, no cameras, no invitation cards with embossed names. The elevator becomes a planet where only two people orbit each other's secrets. I noticed the small things, how his thumb pressed the alarm button with a slow steadiness, the faint callus at the base of his right index finger, the way his jaw softened when he tried not to look at me. Maybe it was the impossibility of retreat, or maybe it was the way the world outside the steel box had been stripped of its power. But his face cracked in a way I had only seen in photos of people caught overtaken by something private. "You look like you've been dragged through a bridal registry," he said finally, eyes flicking to the paper bag on my lap. He didn't mean it cruelly. It was curiosity folded in, like an offer of a small gift. "My aunt requested a book, not a rescue operation," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I intended, worn thin by a day of pretending. He tilted his head, like he thought I was joking, and when he saw I wasn't, his expression softened. "You don't belong here," he said. The words landed with the soft thud of a dropped coin. He didn't mean me as a person at first, a casual truth about the setting, about the room we were in, and the people we were about to meet. But then his eyes sharpened, and he met me, and I felt the sentence become personal. "That's the thing," I said, and went quiet. I wouldn't turn it into a speech. I didn't want pity. I wanted to be seen without footnotes. He was quiet for a beat that stretched. just long enough for me to dredge up the polished line I usually used. Everyone belongs somewhere. And then I didn't use it. I let the silence be an honesty instead. The elevator smelt faintly of lemon cleaner and the cologne at his throat, a steady, warm baritone of cedar and something electric. "My sister used to take me to charity balls when we were kids," he said then, voice lower, more like a confession than the casual banter I had expected. She believed in people she hadn't met yet. He stopped, swallowed. The light in the elevator made a stripe across his cheek. She used to say that belonging is a decision, that sometimes you have to let people sit with you long enough to decide they belong. I found myself telling him things I'd planned to tuck away for people who would earn the right to hear them. It was as if the elevator, failing at its primary job, has succeeded at another, making room for truth. I said the thing I'd said once, years ago, to a friend who had shrugged and then never mentioned it again. My mother had been ashamed once when she didn't have the right coat, how she would stand by the door and smooth her skirt like it was a confession. I told him about the small scholarship I had gotten to put myself through school, about the bookstore where I spent mornings stacking stories and afternoons apologizing if the register took too long to add someone's total. I told him about the quiet shame that hangs around you when you feel, for long stretches, like an understudy in your own life. He listened. He didn't fix me with platitudes or diminish the edges of my words. When he spoke, it was with the kind of focus that made me feel like a subject being studied, not a spectacle. "I lie a lot," he admitted at one point. "Not because I want to, but because people presume a version of me that's easier to sell. I've built things, companies, foundations, because I wanted them to mean something. But somewhere along the way, the script got louder than the thing it was trying to tell." He laughed softly, a sound with an undercurrent of fatigue. "You're not the only one who knows how to be small to avoid breaking things. There's an odd comfort in being lowered into someone else's confession. In that humming, halted space, when the city was reduced to a dimly lit number on a panel, we were only two people telling each other truths no one had asked for. The minutes were oddly merciful. We traded stories like children swapping sandwiches, bits of the past offered in the hope of connection. At one point, he asked what I would do if I could do anything without worrying about consequence. I told him I would open a small school library in a neighborhood that had none. He said without hesitation that he'd help, and his answer did not come with a press release or a contractual clause. We both laughed at that, an honest, bewildered laugh. And then, as if embarrassed by our own candor, we both looked up when we heard someone at the door. Metal scraped, tools, a murmur. The door sighed open like someone letting air into a pinched space, and light flooded back into the carriage. For a second, the world outside felt too intrusive, dense with judges and time. He stepped aside in a gesture that could have been courtesy or calculation. I straightened my skirt. The paper bag crinkled in my lap like a small nervous animal. The ballroom doors were open. They always are in hotels, giant portals swollen with chandeliers and the noise of people doing important things. We moved through the crush of polite bodies and into the gutter of glances. It's a peculiar thing to walk into a room with someone who could, with a word, redirect its current. People who mattered tilted and watched us like weather, curious, sometimes forecastingly cold. A cluster of faces formed a small coast around an island of suspicion, and I could feel their breath against the back of my neck. "You look familiar," someone murmured. I heard the undertone, the way familiarity meant gossip. The doorman's smile was the machine kind, necessary, rehearsed. I tried to keep my heartbeat small in my throat. My heels clicked like a guilty verdict. "Mr. Bennett," a woman said as we passed a table, the word shaped like an announcement. Guests turned. Cameras, those small modern devices people keep like talismans of presence, blinked. I felt heat rise in my neck. The choir of whispers began. Who is she? What is she doing there? Lovely, brave, unfortunate, strategic, words ricocheted without landing.
Jake walked with that same steady composure, as if his posture alone could silence the rustle of speculation. He offered me to the room like a shield, an angle of his shoulder, a slight flourish of his hand, that ownership of social script that he performed like a ritual. My instinct was to shrink, to become as forgettable as possible. But there was a thread of something in the way he had looked at me in the elevator that resisted erasure. "We're his date," I heard him tell someone in a voice that landed like a choice. He wasn't saying it in a casual, "this is convenient" way. It came out like a small defiance. The murmur shifted, then lengthened like a ripple across water. I could feel my own face flush, not entirely from fear. It was exposure, the hot, bright kind that leaves you raw but oddly clean. Someone from the other table whispered my name. My aunt had been name-checked earlier in the evening when I hand-delivered the gift. The woman who had asked about my family smiled in the way privileged people do when they think they're being gracious. Lauren spread like a cold curtain across the ballroom. She arrived with the inevitable entourage, perfectly coiffed, a dress cut to the exact curve of architecture, a laugh that hinted at poison. She had the polished look of someone who expected admiration as her due. I had seen photos of her in magazines, always poised, a carefully selected color palette. She took people's warmth as if it were a currency she held in abundance. When she saw us, the smile she offered was the brief, measured kind that signaled calculation. "Of course," she said. "Jake, darling, how nice." Her voice was coated sugar, and you could taste the grit underneath. The first thing she did was comment on my shoes. Not directly. She did it in that barbed, feminine way that says more about hierarchy than footwear. "Interesting choice for this event," she said, eyeing the sensible heel, the kind that says you value comfort because you have a life beyond appearances. The laughter around her was small, genteel. I felt myself shrink toward the center of my bones, where there is a catalog of all the times people have tried to tell you your place. Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The room seemed to hold its breath. I had to make a choice in that metallic space between pretending I didn't mind and answering. I straightened, which is an action that both feels small and is rarely small in its consequences, and I told myself to breathe. "You know," Lauren said, stepping closer, scent of champagne flirting with the air, "I always wondered what you kept in your back pocket this time of year. I suppose it's interesting." Her smile widened, like a photograph with all the colors slowly drained from it. The chorus of whispers swelled.
I could hear things like charity case and how convenient, like the hush of rain on a faraway roof. A man near the bar snickered. A woman in pearls tutted. It was astonishing how quickly a room could morph into a tribunal. I felt anger, a hot, bright thing rise in my chest. Not at Lauren, at what she represented. The certainty that some people can define you in a single moment and the world will agree to rehearse the definition. Jake did something that surprised me. He took my hand. It was not a cinematic, exaggerated clasp. It was a careful, private gesture meant to anchor me in a sea of pointed faces. I felt his fingers curl around mine, a steady, strong thing, and in that small connection a cable of protection ran between us. There was an electricity in the contact that had nothing to do with the rumor of him. It felt like a practical, human decision. "I'm his date," I heard him say again, but this time with a firmness that made the room recalibrate. He said it in a way that didn't invite negotiation. Heads turned, conversation hiccuped. Lauren's smile tapered into something cold and deliberate. "He? Date? Jake, are we at a costume party?" she asked, loud enough so everyone could catch the barb. The group nearest them snickered, encouraging. "Why don't you let the woman answer that?" Jake said. It was a small prod, but it was precise. He gave me space to speak, and that space felt like an allowance of dignity. I told the truth, small and flat. "I'm Emily. I came up to drop off a gift for my aunt." My voice did not waver as much as my stomach felt like it did. I watched faces as if they were pages being turned. Some were curious, some were derisive, and some, surprisingly, a few were quietly sympathetic. Lauren's eyes landed on me with the appraisal of an appraiser. "You couldn't be more wrong for this room," she said. There was no grace in it, only the arithmetic of exclusion. Jake closed the distance between them like someone folding a map to hide a route. "You'll say anything to make yourself feel superior," he told her quietly. The words came without his usual inclination to polish them into press-ready statements. He was raw, and it unsettled everyone who preferred him to be a beacon of resolve, not a man. Then, in a motion that was both sudden and inevitable, he turned away from Lauren and leaned into the center of the gossip like you lean into a closing door to hold it. His voice picked up volume, and for a second I thought maybe someone had moved a microphone under his jaw. "Listen to me," he said. The room angled in as if pulled by a magnet. "This is not a guessing game. You can call whatever you like, but tonight there's one person who gets to decide who she is, and that's her." His eyes found mine. I felt like someone had handed me a relic and told me to hold it steady. Emily Hart is my date tonight because I asked her to be. Anyone who needs more explanation than that can go by it.
There was a ripple, the way a stone thrown into a still lake throws concentric questions outward. I could feel the social current recalibrating. Some eyes slid away, embarrassed. Others sharpened, hungry for gossip. Lauren's expression shifted. Her composure was a mask. Under it, I could make out something like outrage and a flicker of something else. Surprise, perhaps, that the man she thought belonged exclusively in her orbit could choose a different story. "He asked her," she said, the words like a challenge. "Is this supposed to be some sort of joke, Jake? Really?" It would have been plausible, in any other story, for him to step back, laugh, and let social costs drive the narrative. But he didn't. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to lean toward him, collecting the weight of whatever he was choosing to place on us. He exhaled, and the sound was not quite a laugh. "Maybe it is a joke," he said. "Maybe it's the kind of joke where the punchline is you don't get to define other people by how well they dress or who they love. Maybe the joke is on you." He laughed then, but the sound was not cruel. It was a clean, decisive thing that cut through the supper murmurs. The room made a collective sound like a gust. Lauren's face tightened, her lips thinning into a line that might have once been a smile. Then he did something that made my chest disappear under my collar. He turned to the nearest table where a group had been whispering someone's name in a tone that suggested they were betting on the outcome of our encounter. He leaned forward, eyes steady. "I love her," he said. It was a declaration with the force of a door closing behind it. The words landed with a weight they hadn't intended to carry, because the room had reduced them to theater. People blinked, some mouths forming the letter O as if the sound might become a rumor. For me, the world snapped into a focus I had never allowed myself. Time compressed into the length of that sentence. I felt like glass, delicate and sharp. There was a stunned silence, like the hush that falls after a storm's first crack. I wanted, absurdly, to run. I wanted to correct him, to fold the moment into something smaller and softer. But the look on his face was true in a way that left no space for that. It was not a celebrity hyperbole. It was not an image management maneuver. It was vulnerability worn like armor, and it asked something of me I had rarely permitted, to meet it without flinching. You must understand that none of this felt like a movie script. Nobody had asked for a scene like this. It was raw and exposed and terrifying. Part of me cataloged the pragmatic consequences, headlines, whispers, the way this would rearrange people's expectations. But the larger part of me lived in the moment like a person discovering a new sense. His declaration was not only a claim about affection, it was a reclamation of narrative. He had chosen to stand in front of me, and in doing so, he unsettled the entire room that had been lined up to tell me my place.
Loring's face broke in a way I had never seen. The practiced cold slid away, revealing the thin human ripple beneath, the kind of thing that, if you looked closely, is often more pitiful than powerful. She retreated into the crowd as if needing the safety of numbers, and the murmurs resumed with a different tenor, less cruel perhaps, more fascinated. People love a rupture. They love a spectacle that proves life can upend the neat choreography they spend their days practicing. Someone clapped, a small ironic sound. Someone else cheered, which made others laugh nervously. The band picked the tempo back up as if music could stitch a place back together. Jake's hand tightened momentarily on mine. It was an anchor, a reminder that whatever else the room would do, there was one person in it who had made an irreversible choice. When we finally moved away from the center of attention, I felt fragile as a moth wing. Adrenaline had rearranged my insides. People were already adjusting their stories, retrofitting their mental pictures to accommodate the new fact that this man had publicly chosen me, right there under the chandelier. I wanted to be grateful. I wanted to be annoyed at the spectacle. Mostly, I wanted to find a place where my cheeks stopped buzzing. We found our way to the hotel's outdoor terrace, a small slice of skyline that smelled of cold air in the distant city, its lights like pinpricks through gauze. It was quieter there, the sound of the ballroom damped by doors and glass. The night felt clean as laundry under a moon. Someone had turned a heater on, and a soft breath of warmth puffed near our knees. Jake stood for a moment, looking at the skyline like he was reading a map only he could see. He had a cigarette in his hand. He had not smoked once inside, and he struck a match with a nervous, deliberate motion. The flame made a small golden island. I watched him more carefully than I had in a long time. In the elevator he had been so human. It was almost a relief to see him private now, still like he had been, but markedly himself again. "You could have left me in there," I said, because I needed to test the line between gratitude and indignation. He exhaled a little laugh. "And then what would I have done? Told my secretary I'd been haunted by the ghost of my conscience? No, I wanted you beside me." There was an earnestness in his voice that made me look at him differently, less in awe, more in the particular reality of a person who had made a decision and kept it. He held the match out and then, after a beat, took back the invitation card that had been pressed into his hand earlier in the evening, a small rectangle of stiff paper that had represented an exclusion. He folded it double, then once more. The paper crackled. "What are you doing?" I asked, more curious than sensible. He pinched the folded paper between fingers that usually signed contracts and quarters and promises. His thumb hesitated near the flame. He looked at me as if seeking permission or offering it both at once. "You said your aunt's party made you feel like you didn't belong," he said. "Maybe we can stop pretending those invitations mean anything." He struck the cigarette out on the stone, and then, in a motion that felt both theatrical and private, he held the folded card to the flame. The tiny edge blackened and curled. Smoke rose, fine, black, as if the world were letting go of an old script. We watched the paper burn, and I felt small, like a secret being released into the sky. There was a symbolic satisfaction to it. A shard of paper that had once been a gate closing on people like me, now reduced to ash in the scent of cheap flame. He looked at me then, the city behind him a scatter of indifferent lights. "I don't want anyone telling you what your life is worth," he said. "If people want to make it about anything other than your choices and who you are, that's their problem. There are moments when things change without fireworks. A tiny, private decision can be a revolution." Standing there with the charred remnant in my hand felt like the beginning of a different language, one where the ledger of worth is measured by actions, not tickets. We talked, really talked on that terrace as if the city had been something we were leaning away from.
He asked about the bookstore and the children's anthology, and what I thought about the idea of libraries in neighborhoods that had none. I told him, more wildly than I ever had, that I thought books could function as a kind of brave muscle, something you exercise and it grows stronger. He listened like someone who would act on the impulse to build. When our conversation faded, it did so not with the awkwardness that often follows public spectacle, but with a quiet, shared exhaustion. He stepped closer, and this time there was no crowd and no drama. He brushed a crumb from my shoulder with the gentleness of someone who respects what is small and private. It was an intimacy that had nothing to do with headlines and everything to do with care. We kissed then, which is to say we stepped into the kind of contact that was both inevitable and tender. There was nothing frantic about it, no fevered urgency. Instead, it was a soft, defining thing, the sort of kiss that feels like a permission slip. It tasted faintly of smoke and citrus, and in the small, self-contained orbit of that terrace, it rewired whatever I had believed to be permanent about my life plan. When we pulled apart, the city had not changed, and yet I felt the seams of my world altered in a way I could not have anticipated. He stood there, hand in mine, and I felt both the enormous difference between us and the impossible, quiet possibility of a bridge. He had chosen me publicly. I had agreed in private.
The world still held its judgments, but we had our small, stubborn truth. "If you want me to leave," I said, half testing, half hoping, "I will." He looked at me as if the notion was absurd. "No," he said simply, "stay." That, more than any grand gesture, felt like the hinge of things. It was not him rescuing me into a gilded cage. It was him offering a place at a table that he had chosen me to occupy. And it was me taking the chair because, against every instinct that had taught me to be small, I wanted to be there. If you like stories that begin where you least expect them to, stick around for more. There's something about people meeting in the strangest moments that seems to change both of them. We left the terrace with the sound of the band like a distant surf behind us, a small constellation of questions arcing through the night air. The elevator had been the fluke, the ballroom the clamoring theater, the terrace our quiet epilogue. But epilogues have a way of unfolding into prologues before you know it. As the hotel doors closed behind us and we moved back into the street, I felt the city differently. It was the same New York that swallows privacy for breakfast and serves alienation with a side of espresso. But there was now someone who had anchored a small, stubborn claim on my personhood. I thought about my mother, about the way she had smoothed the skirt like an apology, and I felt, in a new way, the courage to let someone stand between me and those old stories. We parted outside the hotel because we each had different roads to walk that night. He back to company obligations, me back to a tiny apartment and a larger question. He gave me his card, which felt absurdly mundane after the events of the evening. It was a piece of paper, but it had a number, and with it, a promise. He smiled in a way that let me know there would be more than one phone call. He said I should sleep, advised me to take the next day off if I needed to, and then he walked away in a way that suggested this was the end of the sentence rather than the end of the chapter. I stood there for a long time after he turned the corner, feeling the night like an afterthought catching up to the present. I had been less than 5 minutes from catastrophe in an unlit box, and less than an hour from being called everything from inconvenient to incredible in a ballroom. I had eaten confetti and a little shame and a slice of protection that felt, frighteningly, like love. When I walked through my apartment door, the city seemed to fold its sound into the room. I put the book down on my kitchen table, the hardcover lying like an artifact from a life that had been a dress rehearsal until that night. My phone buzzed with a text from my mom checking to see if I'd gone. I looked at the message and thought about how much easier it might have been to forward a photo of the chandelier and say, "Look, I was here, I belonged." But that would have flattened it. It would have been a postcard from a life I hadn't yet learned to inhabit. I made tea instead, and as I sat at the table with steam in my face and the city humming outside my thin windows, I felt an odd, luminous exhaustion, the kind that follows a day you know has been a hinge. I found myself smiling without quite deciding to. There were consequences I hadn't counted on, whispers that would follow, a social calendar that might rearrange itself around us, and the slow, complicated work of deciding what it means to accept someone who came from a world that had always told me I didn't belong. But there was also, thick as honey and no less real, the possibility of partnership. The elevator had been a mistake, an accident, the ballroom a crucible, the terrace a small revolution. I slept with my hand under my cheek like an anchor, and in the small hours, dreams slid through me. Images of a tiny library full of children in coat racks too big for them, paperbacks with dog-eared spines, a kind of order that I had always wanted to build. I woke with the taste of smoke still lined in the back of my throat and a card in my pocket that felt both ordinary and like a ticket. The next morning my phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. It was Jake. "Thank you for not running," it said. The sentence was curt, deliberate, and strangely tender. I typed back on instinct. "I didn't run because you asked me not to." There was a pause. Then let's see what happens. I stared at it as if it were a map. The city outside my window continued to arrange itself into the same old geography of subways and stoops and stray pigeons, but something had shifted within me. Belonging, I had learned, in the space between floors and under crystal chandeliers, was not a place you arrived at by invitation alone. It was a conversation you had to be willing to join. The hardest part of making a choice is believing that the people who matter will accept you for it. Jake had, in an instant that felt impossible, said aloud what I had sometimes believed privately, that our stories are not wholly defined by the rooms we happen to enter. By the time the sun threw light into my apartment like an honest hand, I had a plan forming in that small, quiet place in my chest. It involved paperbacks, a small table, paint that might not be professional but would be generous, and the possibility of asking a man with a complicated past to stand beside me as we did real work together. I wasn't naive. I knew headlines and gossip had a way of shadowing the best intentions. I knew that Lauren would not disappear and that some nights would be harder than others. But in the residue of the city's night noise, there was a new vocabulary for me, words that tasted less like apology and more like possibility. I could hear, already, the small sound of a future being argued into place. The hardest part of making a choice is believing that the people who matter will accept you for it. Jake had, in an instant that felt impossible, said aloud what I had sometimes believed privately, that our stories are not wholly defined by the rooms we happen to enter. By the time the sun threw light into my apartment like an honest hand, I had a plan forming in that small, quiet place in my chest. It involved paperbacks, a small table, paint that might not be professional but would be generous, and the possibility of asking a man with a complicated past to stand beside me as we did real work together. I wasn't naive. I knew headlines and gossip had a way of shadowing the best intentions. I knew that Lauren would not disappear, and that some nights would be harder than others. But in the residue of the city's night noise, there was a new vocabulary for me. Words that tasted less like apology and more like possibility. I could hear, already, the small sound of a future being argued into place. There would be decisions to make, conversations to have, and probably 1,000 tiny humiliations and triumphs punctuating the ordinary arc of working together. For now, though, I boiled water for tea and folded the invitation into a neat square, tying it with string I found in a drawer, and I put it in a little box as if putting a past away with care. When the kettle clicked and the room filled with steam, I realized that the elevator had not only stalled us between floors, it had shifted the ground beneath my feet. And while I did not know the shape of what came next, I did know this. The simplest acts, choosing to hold someone's hand in public, burning a piece of paper that stands for exclusion, saying a truth out loud, can make a small, honest life feel like a claim. If you want to follow what happens next, how moments of improvisation turn into plans, and how two people from different worlds try not to break each other, subscribe and stay with me. These things, it turns out, are better when watched unfold with friends. I locked my apartment door and stepped out onto the street, the city already rearranging itself for the day. People passed, engaged in their private orbits. A dog trailed a ribbon of impatience on its leash. A vendor hawked something warm in the morning cold. I walked toward the subway with a cardboard cup of tea in hand and a new kind of steadiness in my step. The elevator had been the beginning. The ballroom had been the test. The terrace had been a small, flaming decision. But as I descended into the underground, weaving through commuters who had no idea that my life had pivoted the night before, I felt the weight of what we'd said and not said. There were emails to send, apologies to rehearse for people I would eventually have to introduce myself to as more than an accessory to a story. There were words that would need careful selection. And there was a single plain card in my pocket, bearing a name and a number, that felt less like a symbol of power and more like a lifeline. I had taken a place at a table by choice. That choice would demand work. It would demand courage. But for the first time in a long while, I believed I could do it on my terms. The subway doors hissed closed, and the carriage took me away. Each stop a small punctuation in a day that, sooner or later, had to answer for itself. The subway carried me under the city like a secret. I rode the same tracks I always had, same graffiti-scarred poles, same smell of wet coats and exhaust. But something about the routine felt altered, as if the map of my days had acquired a new handwritten note in the margin, "Look up." By the time I pushed open the door of the bookstore, the bell chimed the way it always did, 3 little notes like a question. And Maya, who ran the register on Saturday mornings, looked up from the return stack and grinned at me the way she gives presents to herself, with a tiny, private delight. "You look like you survived a gallows," she said, sliding a coffee across the counter like a life raft. "And someone's been generous with dramatic entrances." I laughed, because what else do you do when the world hands you surreal chapters? I told her a version of the night that smoothed the sharp edges. No mention of a public declaration that might turn their quiet little shop into tomorrow's headline. We worked the way people do in places that live on stories. Quiet, hands busy, the small choreography of being useful. Jake called that afternoon. Not a message with celebrity polish, but a number that came through as his name, Jake, like he was a person rather than a brand. He asked if I had time to meet. I said yes, because we both had the taste of the terrace and the hush of the elevator still on our tongues, and because curiosity is a dangerous but honest habit. We met at a small, unbranded cafe 3 weeks later, a deliberate choice on his part, he later admitted, like we were trying to prove to the world that important things can happen somewhere without marble floors. He came with a manila folder, which was oddly domestic for someone who signs million-dollar checks with a fountain pen. Inside were spreadsheets and proposals, but also a simple list written in his handwriting. Needs, wants, do not do. "I don't want this to be another charity spectacle," I said the first time I scanned the documents. I remember it not because I wanted to rebuke him, but because I needed to mark the terms of my dignity. I don't want kids' faces used as props in fundraisers. If you want to help us build something that can survive after press leaves. He read the sentence like it was a map. "Then tell me what survival looks like," he said. So I did. I described a pilot, 2 community libraries tethered to existing schools, staffed by part-time local librarians, stocked with age-appropriate books that reflected the children's lives as well as imagined ones, a tiny mobile bookshelf for rainy days, and a fund for replacing worn spines before they were a match for tears. I sketched a budget that made room for maintenance because nobody thinks about the money it takes to keep a light on. I added a clause he liked, community oversight. No boardroom dictates. The people who would use the space would have a voice in how it ran. He agreed without theatrics. He agreed because he'd learned, in the elevator, the difference between an announcement and a promise. He also insisted on a title for me, Director of Community Programs. And I nearly refused because titles have the habit of knitting you into other people's expectations. But he didn't present it like a promotion meant to make me beholden. He handed the paper across the table like a tool. Take it for a year, he said. Build the pilot. If you hate every day of it, you can walk. If it works, you decide what next looks like. There are offers that sound like traps and offers that sound like doors. This felt like a door with hinges greased by risk. I negotiated terms I thought important: editorial control over programming, a line item for books by local authors, and the right to refuse press events that prioritize spectacle over substance. He accepted them all without a single raised eyebrow. When I left the cafe, the folder in my hands felt not like charity, but like responsibility. The early weeks were granular in a way that makes grand gestures look quaint. We hired a coordinator who lived in the neighborhood we planned to serve. She knew which blocks had closed playgrounds and which parent groups kept up their stoop gardens. We met with principals who were exhausted and skeptical in equal parts. We painted a room in colors we argued about, turquoise or soft yellow, and I learned the exact physics of where a bookshelf needs to sit so the light hits the titles. I learned to show funders photographs of crayon-laced walls without letting the camera chew up the children's dignity. The press found us in that approximate way the press finds anything with a billionaire's name attached. There were articles that called the initiative refreshing, and others that prepared a narrative of a man wanting to soften his image. The difference between intention and interpretation widened like a riverbank. Some days were full of calls asking about next steps. Other days were full of people trying to slot me into a headline I didn't fit. Lauren, predictably, tried to insert herself into our orbit. Her people released a photograph of her attending a charity gala in a strategic color that matched a headline. Someone from that circle suggested, obliquely, that we were staging feel-good theater. The headline wrote itself, and for a while I felt like a puppet whose strings were being examined for provenance. What steadied me was not money or commentary, but the small, ordinary evidence that the work mattered. A 10-year-old who took 3 books home and returned them with schoolwork tucked inside. A teacher who wrote an email at midnight saying the kids were reading at lunch and her voice had a tremor of joy in it. These were not hyperlinked achievements. They were a string of tiny, living proofs. One night, as we closed the painted room and stacked chairs like sentries, I realized my locket, the thin silver piece my mother had given me when I left college, was gone. It was the kind of small disappearance that can rearrange a person. The locket was an old thing, the kind that didn't have monetary value, but held the way my mother used to press a thumb to my hair and say, "You don't have to prove anything." I tore my bag apart, checking pockets and folds. I walked the route I'd taken to the shop, scanning the pavement like a person scanning for a shape of what used to be normal. I called Jake because I had no other model for asking the one man who might be able to help without turning the search into a spectacle. I told him the locket was missing, and that it meant more than the metal would justify. The next day, a small envelope arrived on my desk. Inside was the locket, slightly scuffed but intact. The chain knotted in a way that suggested it had spent a little time in some other hand. There was a note folded beneath it in his neat writing. I found it in the pocket of the coat you gave me that night. I held on to it until I could give it back properly. It was the sort of thing that could have been performed, some public, staged retrieval meant to show devotion. Instead, a quiet logistics team had checked the hotel coat room. He had waited for a moment when only I would see the gesture. He didn't make a statement about permanence or assign meaning to an object. He simply returned something that mattered. The locket felt heavier in my palm, weighted with the sort of proof that actions sometimes provide when words are too slippery. There were harder days, of course. We argued about how public we should be with the kids' faces. There was a board meeting where a skeptical trustee asked, bluntly, what would happen when the funding cycle ended. I said plainly that the work would outlast any one check only if it was built into existing school budgets and if the community had a stake in choosing the books. The trustee nodded like someone convinced by numbers, and then surprised himself with a quiet, warm smile. On the other side of the ledger, there were moments of simple tenderness. I remember walking into a classroom in one of the pilot neighborhoods and seeing a small paper village strung across the ceiling. The children had folded houses from scrap paper, bright roofs, crooked doors, and on the blackboard they had written a single line over and over, "This is our library." A little boy named Mateo pressed a crayon into my hand and said solemnly, "You come here like my aunt." I thought then, not for the first time, how small commitments can be the scaffolding for a life. 6 months moved like a montage that was not always cinematic. Fluorescent lights, hand-painted signs, tag teams of volunteers who came because someone else had shown up. The occasional mayor who wanted a photograph and left before the meeting ended. We had measurable wins. Reading levels crept up, attendance at after-school programs rose. And we had messy realities. Supply chains that break and need improvisation, a librarian who had to leave for family reasons, and the scramble to train a replacement. Jake had his own reckoning. The man who had grown used to controlling narratives learned, slowly, to let processes be messy. He sat on the floor of a children's corner and tried to assemble a cardboard puppet theater with 2 dads who had never tried their hands at something that demanded such humility. He listened when a mother told him her own adolescent could not afford summer camp, and took notes instead of pronouncements. The gestures were small but cumulative. A hand at a shoulder, staying late to hang art, the way he learned to bring gloves and not leave materials boxes until everyone had counted them twice. We traveled together for one of the pilot assessments to a town outside Quito, where a school had agreed to host a mobile library week. The plane ride felt like a private rope drawn taut between 2 points. We were moving toward something that required different languages and a willingness to be out of our element. The town itself was balanced on a ridge, the air crisp and smelling of eucalyptus. Children in blue uniforms ran with an energy that made the adults laugh with relief. The schoolyard was a patchwork of sun and dust. We set up small tents and a stack of bright books. We painted signs in bright letters, "Learn, build, read." The children lined up to choose books as if the act of picking a story was a right of ownership. One girl gave me a drawing she had made of the bookstore back home. In it, I was a stick figure with an enormous smile and a tower of books taller than the buildings. I felt, tangibly, the way small attention collects into proof. It was there, among the quiet chaos and the smell of dust and mango, that Jake asked me to walk with him to the far corner of the field. He had promised he would not stage things for headlines. He kept his promise. He produced a small box that looked like it had been carried in a pocket for months. It wasn't an ostentatious ring, just a plain band that fit his hands as if it belonged there. He sat on a low stone wall and folded his hands around the box, the way he once had the match and the invitation. The children around us watched, curious but unassuming, and a teacher offered a shy smile. "I could write something theatrical," he said quietly, and the cadence of his voice was the one I had heard in the elevator, the one that had contained private things. "But I want honest. In an elevator last winter, I learned that belonging is a decision, not an arrangement. I asked you to be my date that night because I wanted you near me. But more than that, I want to build things with you, not for you. Will you marry me, Emily Hart? Will you keep telling me when I'm being performative? Will you make me earn my right to stand beside you every day?" There was no fanfare. A child nearby raised a hand and asked very seriously if there would be cake. The practicality of the question made both of us laugh until we were crying in the way that comes from being released. I said yes because the word felt like a decision and like a beginning. We didn't kiss in a way that pretended the world had melted. We touched foreheads and promised to keep doing the small, difficult work of being human together. We married the following spring in a church that smelled of lemon oil and old wood, the kind of place that held sunlight in the rafters. We invited fewer people than etiquette demanded and more people than convenience allowed. My mother, who cried until her cheeks were red and blamed the florist for making flowers unnecessary. Maya and the bookstore crew who'd been there for tiled floors and midnight inventory marathons. Parents from the pilot program who insisted on bringing homemade tamales, and a scattering of Jake's friends who had watched his ways soften like wax. Instead of a florist's bill, we asked guests to bring a book to the ceremony. We stacked them along the aisles, covers bright and dog-eared, and the officiant opened the service by reading a letter from a 10-year-old in our first community who had been asked to describe love in a paragraph, and had answered with the sort of commodious clarity children have. Love is someone who brings books back when they borrow them, she had written. We laughed and cried and signed the register with ink that smudged on purpose. Nothing was perfect, and that was the point. We framed a photograph from that first hotel night and placed it on a small table beneath a lamp at the reception. The caption, simple, not performative, read, "When a mistake in engineering turned into the best misdirection of my life." People noticed the smallness of the caption, and then, later, leaned into us and said how much they admired our refusal to make a spectacle of vulnerability. Our honeymoon was not a list of exclusive resorts. We spent 2 weeks with a foundation team in the outskirts of a town in Ecuador, staying in a small guest house that had more mosquito netting than hot water. We taught kindergarten for a morning and watched a child who had never seen a blue crayon draw the sky with a fervor that made everyone in the room feel like adults had been given a lesson. Years settled around us like a comfortable cardigan. We built a small, stubborn nonprofit arm within the Bennett Foundation that resisted press-first logic and leaned into community-led solutions. We named a bookshelf program after my aunt because she had once donated a box of battered copies and written, "For the ones who love stories like they are oxygen." The foundation learned to measure success in more than press releases. Retention of staff, teacher satisfaction, the number of times a child fell asleep with a book on their chest. Lauren retreated from the theater of our lives with a few parting lines that made it onto morning feeds before they faded into human noise. We were occasionally photographed and sometimes misquoted, but those moments were like weather, arbitrary and brief. Our partnership did not cure the gossip machine, it taught us to live in spite of it. The small gestures between us had a way of becoming the architecture of our life. Jake began leaving post-it notes with grocery lists and reminders on the fridge. Bananas, milk, don't forget to call your mother, with a handwriting that never quite decided whether it wanted to be formal. I wrote back in the margins, more often than not, a small scrawl. Pick up more blue crayons. We celebrated wins with rice and small ceremonies. We soothed failures with soup and back rubs that lasted longer than either of us intended. On a rain-soaked Tuesday, when the city smelled like wet asphalt and new promise, my mother came to visit. She had been skeptical at first. Her shame had taught her the language of caution, but she had watched me step into a space where my voice mattered. She put her hand on my face at the doorway and said, "You took a chair, and you sat down. It suits you." It was the kind of compliment that felt like a benediction because it came from the woman who had taught me to smooth my skirt and swallow my intention. The foundation grew in careful increments. We piloted a program that loaned books to families on a sliding fee basis so the children learned stewardship. We trained librarians to host story nights that included parents with language support needs. There were policy meetings where I found my voice, and there were nights I fell asleep with a book open on my chest because that work is patient and exhausting. Jake never offered to fix the hard bits with a check alone. He offered time, presence, and sometimes a phone call that read, simply, "How did the meeting go?" It was the kind of question that implied accountability rather than ownership. Sometimes I still thought of the elevator. In quiet moments, on a late bus, standing in the kitchen washing a pan, I would remember how small and absurd everything had seemed in that tin box between floors, and how the strangest, most accidental friction had revealed a hinge in a life I had thought stable. The elevator had been a private mercilessness and a private kindness in equal parts. We never forgot the ritual of burning the invitation. Once a year, we packed up an old invitation, something that had once meant exclusion, and we watched it curl and go soft in a small flame. We did it quietly, sometimes with children from the program visiting and asking why paper turns to ash. We told them the honest story, because sometimes the old papers are heavy and we need to make room for new pages. There were bad days, as there will always be. Grant proposals that fell through, loved ones who got sick, and the particular loneliness of being a visible person whose interior life is occasionally mistaken for narrative fodder. But there was always for me the steady accumulation of proof. A child handing back a library card like a badge. A teacher who wrote to say her students now asked for reading time with the hunger of a small constructive need. A mother who hugged me at a fundraiser and whispered, "Thank you for letting my child keep the book over the weekend." One evening, years after that first elevator incident, I found myself back on the hotel terrace, not to restage anything, but because the city felt like a place that deserves to be remembered where it has been kind.
Jake had his hand in mine. The heater hummed, light from the street glancing off his cheek like a small, polite sun. We watched people cross the street as if watching a miniature solar system, private and indifferent. He put his hand on my lap and said softly, "Do you ever think about the way everything ends up connected? A broken elevator, a burned invitation, a book handed from one small child to another." "All the time," I said. "I try to map it for people who like tidy stories, but usually it's messy. Sometimes it's a long list of stubborn little things." He smiled, and his smile had the old fatigue folded into it, plus a new sort of peace. "Good," he said. "Messy seems honest." We had never been the kind of couple whose lives were boiled down into a single soluble essence. We were more like a long recipe, ingredients chosen, some burnt and scraped off, some stirred in at the last minute, and always tasted before being presented. We kept a photograph from that night by the bookshelf at home, framed not as a claim but as a memory of how small acts can conspire to alter a life. If being stuck between floors taught me anything, it was that the most improbable beginnings can be the doorway to the most ordinary and noble of tasks, showing up. It was not that a billionaire rescued me. It was that a person I admired and who had the capacity to help decided to join me in the work of making a small corner of the world kinder. We built a life that was neither miraculous nor perfect, but it was steady in the way a good book is. It asks you to keep turning pages. If this story reached you like a friend saying quietly that possibilities can come from the strangest places, then maybe you understand the strange arithmetic of human life. Missteps sometimes equal new maps. If you'd like to follow a few more stories about small revolutions, awkward bravery, and the way kindness complicates everything, subscribe and stay. Share this with someone who could use a reminder that the way we choose each other matters more than the stories people tell about us.